So for this next section, and actually the section after the intermission as well, I'm going to go through a number of examples. And I've got the bottom three sort of grayed out because those are after the intermission. The ones we're going to get into now are, first is diagrams and descriptions, second is what I call relationship ping pong, and the third is ocean fishing. So let's see where that takes us. Diagrams and descriptions. This is going to get us to a site called Kumu. How many of you know about Kumu? All right, well, a few of the people that I've told. Kumu is a wonderful piece of online software that is devoted to primarily helping you create visual network diagrams. You can also do system dynamic diagrams with it. But let's look at this. What we have here is a lobbyist, a congressman, and the congressman's wife. And if I click on the lobbyist picture, what shows up over here is this whole bit of text plus a video all about the lobbyist. If I click on the congressman, what shows up is information about the congressman. So in effect, what you have is a visual table of contents into a whole body of material. Especially if you add nesting onto this, you can have a very interesting way of being able to interface between written kinds of material, or what we would think of as written and visuals, accessed through an overview that really gives you a sense of connection. There's even this thing down here, this Lot 26, that was purchased jointly by the lobbyist, the congressman, and his wife. Now, you get to draw your own conclusions about what all this close connection means. I would invite you to go and look at that. We're not going to continue too far into this, but I just wanted to use this as an example of a system that joins together diagrams and descriptions in a very useful way. Next, we go to relationship ping pong. And I'm going to have to describe this a little bit. This is two people with their subpersonalities. This person A here with a group of subpersonalities, and person B over here with they have the same subpersonalities because I figured it'd be easier for me to describe that. But if you were actually using this approach, each person would do something to identify their subpersonalities. And I'm going to draw some arrows about what happens between them in here. What happens inside them internally, I'll draw over here, and I'll indicate something about what it is in their past that connects with the ping pong that's going on between them. So when you have a conversation between two people, it isn't just between two people, it's between this whole host of subpersonalities in one and the host of subpersonalities in another. So let's play the ping pong a little bit. I'm going to, just to keep this sort of organized, I'm going to say that A is she and B is he. You can project onto it what you like. Oh, I should say, first, this other judgmental means the subpersonality that likes to judge others and is critical of others and the detached sort of stands back and is more calm and rational in a certain sense, but not really engaged. And self-judgmental is critical, but critical of self. And self-sacrificing is not, all about, well, what can I do for the other person? Fairly simple, common patterns. So, other judgmental part in B gets triggered, and he reaches out and says something to A that lands on her self-judgmental part. And she goes, inside. But she's, through her past, has developed a defense pattern that means that when her self-judgmental part gets hurt, she invokes her other judgmental part, and so she counterattacks. And because she knows B pretty well, she can hit. So now B is feeling it in his self-judgmental subpersonality. And his response is to, through his defenses that tie into his past, get him to act more detached. And that has the effect on A that she starts worrying that he's drifting away. And so her response to that is to move into her self-sacrificing subpersonality. But B feels guilty to see A starting to behave that way. So it winds up landing again in his self-judgmental. Okay, so we could go on and on with this. The point is not this story that I'm making up about these two people. The point is that you could use a map of this sort, which is a system diagram, to help after in some relationship you've had some conversation that felt like, this wasn't really a pattern that we want to continue. And after you've done whatever emotional repair you may want to do with it, and you're back, both of you, more or less in your optimal zones, you could use this kind of mapping to gain a lot more understanding about what was going on in each of you, and maybe find some new patterns of interaction that would serve you better. Okay, ocean fishing. Really different topic. And this is not really so much about ocean fishing per se, as the way in which, for so many industrial processes, and not only industrial processes, you need skilled labor, you need some sort of resource, and you need, in this case, the fleet that will enable you to tap that resource. They're all necessary, none of them are sufficient. And they come together in this and, which indicates that you need labor and fish and fleet in order to get any kind of catch. And one of these is going to wind up being your limiting factor, your constraint. There was a time, long, long ago, when there were lots and lots of fish, and the fish stock was not the issue, but there wasn't much in the way of fleet. At that point in time, the sensible strategy, if you wanted to increase the catch, was to build more ships, build more fishing boats, increase the fleet. Well, that's what happened, and it happened too successfully, so that now the limiting factor is no longer the fleet. The limiting factor is the fish stock. So an important thing that happens in systems is that often, if you map things out well, you will discover what's the limiting factor, what's the constraint. And if sometimes you want to work with that constraint to open it up and free it up, other times it may be that you're just where you want to be with that constraint and you're over-resourced in the others. So maybe really what we need is less fleet. This is all part of the broader sense of constraints. We just went through that sort of pattern. You can also have constraints where it's along a series of steps in a process. And again, I'd like to emphasize that maybe you want a bigger result, so you have to increase B, but maybe the result you're getting now is just fine, and so you're over-resourced in A and C, and if you want to get some economies, then A and C are the place to look for those. It's by mapping it out that you get to see these things clearly. And in fact, there's a whole management technique called the theory of constraints that is based on carefully looking in all kinds of business processes at what are the constraining factors and working to open those up. So I'm going to step into the next example. This one is habits. So last week, when we talked about conscious and subconscious and fast thinking and slow thinking, we wound up with a slide that, among other things, said that slow reflective thinking helped to monitor and modify fast associational thinking. Well, fast associational thinking is where our habits are. That's, I mean, it's really the same thing. So changing habits requires that we use our reflective parts of our minds to be able to modify what's happening here. And it takes time. The research I've been seeing suggests that it takes, to really change stuff that gets into an automatic habit, it takes at least 3 weeks, and normally more like a few months. So part of the challenge with changing habits is hanging in there during that space of time, because it's not instant. So I want to start with something out of this book called The Power of Habit. One of those good popular books in which he models his system diagram for habit looks like this. That you start with something that's a cue. You walk into the kitchen, I'm hungry. You didn't feel hungry before you walked into the kitchen, but something about walking into the kitchen makes you think that. And then there's some routine that you do based on that cue. And if it's a habit, there's bound to be something that you experience as a reward for having done the habit. And then it comes back around and reinforces by association that cue. And so that builds the groove. Well, that's fine for sort of a description of the way habits work, but I don't find this diagram terribly useful when I want to change habits or if I want support in building habits. So because I can choose what kind of diagram works for my purpose, I'm going to build on this diagram and modify it. And I do it very much in the spirit of encouraging you to feel exactly the same freedom to make diagrams that work for you. First thing we're going to do is add context, of course. And recently came across some research that apparently has been around for a while, but I wasn't aware of it, looking at rats and drugs. So for a long time, people did these and publicized these experiments where they had rats in a cage and they gave them 2 water containers. One water container was pure water and the other water container had either heroin or cocaine in it. And lo and behold, the rats liked the drugged water, and in fact they liked it so much that they basically starved themselves to death just drinking the drugged water. And so this was used to say, oh my God, this stuff is so terribly addictive. You know. Anyway, you know the routine. Except that some other researcher noticed that the rats in that experiment were put in barren cages by themselves. So they were in solitary confinement in an awful place. So we thought, well, let's do another experiment. Let's build a really wonderful place for rats. So there'll be fuzzy walls and things to play with and other rats to play with, and it's just sort of rat heaven. And we'll also put in the 2 water sources and see what happens. Well, the rats did discover the drugged water sources, but they didn't like it. And none of them died. None of them were particularly problematic. And then later, they did an experiment where they put some rats in that awful solitary confinement setup and had them starting to get addicted to the drugs, and then took them out of it and put them into rat heaven. And within a very short period of time, they were ignoring the drugged water and off and playing. So it isn't that the drugs were addictive. It was that the drugs in an awful context were addictive. So one of the things to pay attention to if you want to change habits or you want to reinforce a habit is what's your context? What is it that supports that cue? But there's more that I want to change here? What about this reward thing as the only thing that's there at the end of after your routine action? I would rather say the results. One of the results winds up being a reward, but there are other consequences too. I mean, usually when you want to change a habit, it's because of those other consequences. And so by putting them on the diagram, making them explicit, if I was really doing this with a specific habit, then I would list out what I saw as those other consequences. And maybe if I brought those other consequences in as associations to the cue, not just the reward, it might affect whether or not I really wanted to do anything based on that cue. And then there's the motivation question. What is it that I'm really after with that reward? Maybe I can find a different way to satisfy what I'm really after. So it's helpful to dig down in, look at, what are the, in basic drive terms, what is it that you're really trying to get out of? Is it that you're eating that cookie because it reminds you of the good times you had as a kid and the cookies that your mom made, and you're feeling a little lonely at the moment, and so, well, it's actually not about the cookie. And maybe if you really understand that, you can find a way to more directly satisfy your whatever it is that is really motivating you. So there we go with an enlarged picture for habits. And I want to ask and see, anybody have a habit, either something that they'd like to change away from or add into, or add on a new habit? Any suggestions for habits? Yeah.
Just daily exercise, trying to get in the habit of doing that and not dropping off after like 72 hours.
Right, right. So let's look at this in terms of something like daily exercise, okay? So I would start here with motivations. What is it that's really motivating you in terms of that exercise? And I don't need an answer from you, but because this isn't, it's not like I want to interrogate you relative to this stuff. We all have our issues with exercise. But with that, because it takes a while to establish a habit, there are ways in which it's often helpful to invent a reward. Maybe it's, we may roll our eyes at gold stars, but feedback. One of the reasons that activity trackers are helpful is because of the feedback that you get from it. So anything that is much shorter term than the long-term rewards that you're going to get from exercise, you need to build into it something that is sort of more immediately nourishing. So that's just on the reward side. There may be, what's the context in which you're doing the exercise? Are there places where it's simply more fun to do it? Maybe with others, maybe without others. Anyway, the point being to use this sort of diagram to look at the multiple places of intervention. One of the things about systems is that there's rarely simply one cause. In fact, you narrow your vision too much if you think in terms of just one cause. What you want to do is look at what are all of the places that you could intervene in the system, and then once you've gotten a sense of those, look at, well, what are the priority places? What are the places that are easiest to access? All right. I think I'm going to, is that okay? Do you want to offer another one or suggestion?
Yeah, I was watching something about the reward thing recently, and they suggested that after you do like the daily exercise, just have a piece of chocolate. And even though that sounds like kind of, counterproductive, they found that just having that little reward helps
Right.
your brain make those like, oh yes, I'm getting reward things. And they found that after a couple weeks, most people stopped eating the chocolate and had established that habit.
Right. Yep. So you need something to carry you through those first weeks or even months that may eventually fall off. And you can say, well, geez, I should just be able to do it. Why do I need to trick myself in this way? Well, your subconscious doesn't think that way. And you might as well work with it.